In the endless dark of the far future, there are ships whose names are never sung, whose presence in orbit is enough to make entire worlds fall silent. They are the black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, vessels tasked with harvesting the most dangerous resource known to mankind, human psykers. From hive underbellies to noble palaces, they are taken in shackled silence, herded into the void aboard vessels that few return from. To witness a black ship depart is to glimpse humanity's most fragile tether to survival, and to sense a truth no citizen dares whisper aloud, that even the Imperium's survival is built upon sacrifices it will never openly honor. And inside those shadowed hulls, the last journeys of the unsanctioned unfold not as stories of heroism, but as a procession toward either death or a fate more terrible. If you find yourself drawn to the hidden corridors of the Imperium, to the untold stories that breathe in its silence and its dread, then remain with us. Subscribe, share, and lend your presence to this channel, for it is here that we unearth the voices too often consumed by the darkness. Your support keeps these forgotten tales alive, echoes that would otherwise be lost in the warp. Chapter 2. Shackled beneath the Aquila. The chamber beyond the blue-banded hatch was a dormitory hold shaped like a sermon, long, narrow, and designed so that every eye, if it dared to rise, would fall on a single brass Aquila, bolted to the far bulkhead. Its wings were filmed with the ship's breath, its beak darkened, its twin heads turned not to protect us, but to watch the aisle that cut the bunks in two. A servitor had stenciled ward ink around its edges in careful script, the letters raised and flaking where oil mist had settled. Beneath the icon stood a plinth, barely high enough to be called an altar, and on that plinth lay a book chained shut, its clasps hexagrammic, its corners scarred where someone had once knelt too close and struck it with the metal of their cuffs. The air was warmer here, not with kindness, but with systems heat bleeding through the deck. It smelled faintly of recycled breath and the sharpness of disinfectant, a smell that would come to mean sleep if we were permitted sleep. They brought us to numbered pallets, set at regular intervals, lengths of webbing folded atop each like impeccable tongues. A warden undid my wrist iron, only so long as it took to belt me to the pallet, and locked me down again at a ring welded overhead. The restraint was not absolute. One could turn, could sit, could stand under supervision, but the geometry of it kept the body honest. I looked once at the Aquila, because to look was easier than to measure the length of the chain, and I felt the same stillness as when a sister of silence passed by, a smoothing out, as if the icon itself were a mask over the anxious face of the room. We were arranged in double files, facing inward across the aisle, so one's field of vision was always full of other pale faces pretending to be walls. At the end of the row, a vox grill crackled and delivered the catechism of rules without the courtesy of a human voice. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not pray aloud in rhythm. Do not sleep during muster hours. Do not share rations, fluids, or touch. Report anomalies by raising the right hand and looking down. The last instruction was repeated twice, and I realized the gesture was designed so the wardens could see submission without inviting a meeting of eyes that might become a bridge. The boy from my earlier cell was not here. The minor woman was 2 pallets down, her hands open on her knees, skin the color of rock under a thin film of dust, gaze fixed not on the Aquila or the floor, but somewhere in the interval between. The first hour in that hold taught me that silence there had organs. There was the thin breath of the lumen strips, the soft tick as the cycle regulators advanced behind the bulkhead, the deep animal heartbeat of the ship steady as a drum buried in earth. Over it all, at a frequency that slid off the ear and found the bone, the Geller field sang its single note. It was a promise and a threat. I am here. Do not test how thin I am. A sister stood by the hatch, still as a blade shelved in velvet, her +++ marks on the breastplate dull in the lumen, her presence carving a shallow valley in the pressure of the room. We arranged our thoughts around that absence, the way small streams arrange themselves around a stone. Rations were delivered with a ceremony that made ceremony look like efficiency. Servitors moved down the aisle with trays that locked into rails, sliding bowls into the handspan slots beside each pallet. The food was more liquid than solid, heavy with salts, a leveling agent for minds that wanted to climb. The water had a sweetness like old copper. No one complained. Complaints assume a listener, and the hold had only witnesses. After the servitors passed, an adept in brown robes checked each bowl against a tally, and whispered to himself in low Gothic, tallying our small compliances, as if they were prayers. When he reached me, the penance scar on his bald scalp flashed under the lumen, a map of vows I did not want to read. The man placed across from me wore a pilgrim's token, a cheap tin charm in the shape of St. Drusus's sword. It had been allowed to remain, a mercy, or an experiment. He held it in his bound hands, and worked his thumb along the edge until a red crescent rose in his skin. I was meant for shrine duty, he said too quietly to be a voice, more like an understanding he let leak. Now my duty is not to be a door. I did not answer. Answering is a kind of touch. He seemed to hear my caution. He gave a fractional nod, and slid the token back under the webbing, where it would press against his palm, and remind him that the world was not entirely made of iron and script. The muster within the muster began. Names were read in bunches. We watched as chains were unhooked, as bodies stood and tried to remember what it meant to stand without the anchor of a pallet, as wardens guided them toward the Aquila, and passed it to a secondary hatch. Those who returned came back different, by increments one would miss, if one had not been fixed across from them, watching the face as it entered and as it came back, the difference a subtraction rather than an addition. Sweat at the hairline, a new steadiness that was not calm, the eyes no longer skittering along surfaces, but settling as if the gaze had weight. These were the ones sent to the green band doors. They were not more dangerous, they were more usable. My band kept me in place for hours, measured by the march of servitors and the soft mechanical communion of the vox. We were made to recite the Imperialis without cadence, each word placed like a stone at irregular intervals, so the road would not become a rhythm that attracted attention. From the light of Terra to the farthest night, someone said 3 pallets down, and it passed along the row as a broken rosary might, beads separated by lengths of raw string. When it reached me, I placed my stone where it would not line up with the others, and felt the hold release a breath it had not taken. A disturbance came not as a scream but as an insistence of breath. A woman in the far corner began to draw air in and let it out without sound, faster and faster, as if she were a bellows and somewhere a spark needed feeding. A warden moved without haste. The sister moved without sound. The woman's head tilted as if listening to something behind a bulkhead we could not access. The Aquila above us watched. The sister did not touch her. She stood close enough that the woman's breath stuttered and found an edge. The woman's hands opened and closed, and then went still. The sister inclined her head exactly once in acknowledgement of a transaction completed, quiet in exchange for quiet. When they led the woman away, she looked back at none of us. After that, the hold grew easier to inhabit, as if a sharp object had been removed from a pocket where it did not belong. Sleep came as sanctioned intervals, when the lumen dimmed to a low amber. Bound as we were, one learned to turn like a tide, together, shoulders shifting in sympathy down the row. In the first sleep I dreamed of ash falling inside a cathedral that had never seen fire. In the second, I dreamed of a door underwater, and a book chained shut on the ocean floor. Between the two, a servitor checked the tension of the webbings, and adjusted my chain by one link, and the intimacy of that practical correction felt like a kindness, until I remembered the barcode stitched raw beneath its spine and decided that kindness here was only another function. When the third muster came, my name rang from the vox in a tone that was identical to all the names before it. The webbing slid off my shoulders, The warden's gauntlet pinched the chain and steadied me as I stood. I did not look at the Aquila, because I had looked enough. The aisle ran straight, and then kinked like a broken finger before the hatch. The sister who waited there was not the one from my earlier tests. Her aura drew the itch out of my eyes, and set it on the floor between us where it could not crawl. For a heartbeat I felt ordinary. The shock of that ordinariness made my breath catch. It is a strange mercy to be briefly simple in a place that makes complexity into guilt. They brought 3 of us through the secondary hatch, and into a vestibule where the temperature dropped 2 degrees, and the smell of promethium returned, thin as a rumor. A shrine to Saint Praxedes had been bolted to a knee-high spur of bulkhead, its glass scarred with fine scratches, where fingernails had tried and failed to get purchase. I looked down as the instructions required and raised my right hand. A warden adjusted the set of my cuff and nodded, not to me but to the habit that had carried me this far. The sister's visor turned a fraction. If there was a face behind it, it did not matter. She was the absence that pledged the space to remain what it was. The inner hatch opened on a stair that went up and down at once. A trick of perspective worked by the ship to make certain no one could remember the path they had taken. We followed the down that felt like up and arrived at a chamber marked by a sigil I did not recognize. A symbol that might have been a stylized hand or a sun seen through heavy cloud. Within, adepts waited with the same circlets and needles as before, but the arrangement was tighter, the distances smaller, the feeling of being measured more exact. The ritual less like sorting and more like shaping. Above the far dais, a fresco had been painted directly onto the bulkhead in layers of oil that caught the lumen. The emperor crowned by grief, his gaze level and uncondemning, his right hand not raised in benediction, but held at his side as if he too were waiting to hear the next name. Blue band evaluation, the vox intoned, and the words did not sound like words so much as a stamp pressed into hot wax. The adepts moved us from the vestibule into another hold, smaller but more suffocating than the first. The bunks were stacked 3 high, along the bulkhead, narrow slats of steel, with straps to bind us in place when the ship lurched through the tides of the Imperium. Above the rows, incense burners swung on chains, their smoke tracing pale lines that refused to settle, as though even the air recoiled from what lingered here. The Aquila was there too, another, not the same, carved directly into the wall and filled with black resin that drank the lumen. To lie beneath its gaze was to feel less than an insect pinned to parchment, catalogued, judged, already archived. We were tethered in place with cuffs that joined wrist to bunk frame. The chains were short enough to prevent contact with another soul, long enough to let one shift from side to side, and know that one's body still belonged, however faintly, to itself. Every sound in the chamber was amplified by that arrangement. The scrape of a boot, the rattle of breath, the muffled sobs that traveled through iron like blood through vein. At times the ship seemed to lean closer, its engines groaning like a throat, clearing itself. And in those moments the lumen dimmed until faces were only pale masks suspended in the dark. The sister stationed at the door never moved. Her presence was its own command to obey. Rations came less regularly here, as though time itself bent differently inside these walls. Sometimes 3 feedings in a span, sometimes none for what felt like days. The food bricks grew drier, crumbling like ash between teeth, while the water bore the faint tang of recycled copper piping. Hunger became more than physical. It sharpened the mind into a blade turned inward, carving at patience and faith. Whispers began despite the rules. Fragments of prayer, half-remembered hymns, murmured promises to the emperor, or to things that were not him. Every whisper risked exposure, for the sisters heard even what was not said aloud. One voice carried too long in the dim. The sister stepped forward once, silent as a dream, and when she stepped back there was one less pallet filled. The straps lay neatly folded, awaiting the next body. Night, if it could be called that, pressed heavily. The straps kept us pinned as the ship passed deeper into the warp. That was when the bleed became worse. Minds brushed against one another like torn sails in a storm, catching and tearing in the currents. Dreams leaked into the waking world. Men gasped at visions of oceans they had never seen. Women screamed the names of dead children who were not theirs. I felt it too, an intrusion that pressed against the back of my thoughts like a tongue at a wound. I tried to turn away from it, but there was nowhere to turn. Only the Aquila on the wall, black and vast, reminding us that every thought was weighed, and every flaw marked for judgment. The worst came when one of us lost the fight. A youth strapped to the top bunk began to laugh, quiet at first, then louder, until the sound became a ragged tearing that filled the hold. It was not his voice, it was something that used his lungs as a doorway. Chains rattled as he thrashed, teeth snapping at the air, eyes rolled white. The sister moved with the inevitability of a tide. She did not raise a weapon, she simply stepped beneath him, placed a hand to his throat, and everything stopped. The laugh died. The youth sagged against his straps, breath gone, eyes still open but empty. The servitors came then, unfastening him with ritual precision, carrying him away into the silence that awaited us all. His bunk straps were folded as carefully as before, ready for the next name on the slate. The hold returned to stillness, but it was not the same stillness. It was heavier, settled into the marrow. We understood then that beneath the Aquila, bound in chains, hunger gnawing and dreams bleeding, we were no longer men and women. We were cargo, living, breathing, dangerous cargo. And the black ship, vast and voiceless, was nothing more than the coffin prepared to ferry us toward judgment. The change announced itself as a taste before it became a sound. Metal on the tongue, then bitter citrus, then the chalky smear of old bone. The lumen snapped to a sterner brightness, as if the ship had narrowed its eyes, and the incense chains overhead went still in air that no longer moved the way air should. Somewhere 3 decks away, a bell struck, not an alarm, not frantic, but ceremonial, as if some ancient hand had been waiting years to ring this exact note at this exact moment. The Geller Fields hum, once a single held line, deepened into a chord that lived in the jaw hinge and the molars, turning every mouth into a tuning box. We were crossing. The warp did not arrive like a storm battering hull and heart. It arrived like a room you've entered 1,000 times that is suddenly wrong. All the furniture moved half an inch, doorways half a thought to the left. A breath took longer to finish than it should, and yet the next one came too soon, as if time had slipped sideways and was trying to find itself by touch. The Aquila on the wall seemed closer, not larger, closer, the cup of each feather's quill within a finger's reach, though I could not have stood to touch it if my life had depended on the gesture. Perhaps that was the point. A vox sigil whispered from the grill by the hatch, the same catechism it always sent before translation, each word set into its proper place like a rivet driven home. Maintain posture, fix eyes downward, recite within the mind without rhythm. Do not answer voices that know the names of your dead. The last line was new to some of us. I saw a twitch travel down the bunks, an involuntary shiver as minds remembered their graves. The sister at the door did not shift, but her presence grew more defined, as if wind had pressed cloth against a statue so that every edge showed. For one exquisite breath, the itch behind my eyes vanished completely. That absence felt like clear water after a lifetime of grit. The first bleed was gentle. It came as a smell of rain on hot ferrocrete, a memory I did not own but which lived in me for a breath, and then in the miner woman, 2 pallets down, and then in the pilgrim with the tin saint, and then in the man beyond him, each of us holding it and letting it pass, a shared weather. Then sound. A lullaby in a dialect I could not name, carried on the air without air moving, picked up, put down. A warden's stave tapped once, a reminder that we were not alone even inside our skulls. The lullaby thinned until it became only a pattern the Geller hum refused to admit. Then the hard edge arrived. A voice spoke in a place that had no geometry. It did not call any name aloud. It offered promises like a ledger. The boy who had been placed where my noble cellmate might have been, if fate had held to straight lines, began to breathe fast, eyes fixed on nothing and everything in the way that means looking inward into a room with too many doors. "Don't," I said without sound, because sound would have made a bridge. He glanced at the Aquila, and his breath steadied half a step. The voice that was not a voice pressed again, and beyond the bulkhead something the size of a cathedral dragged its thought across the hull. The incense burners chimed once, not from motion but from decision. Ritual asserted itself against geometry. A litany seeped through the metal, not from the wardens' mouths, they kept their silence, but from the ship itself, many-throated and low, the words braided with machine noise and drive surge. An old prayer to the Emperor as anchor taught to steel and circuit long before any of us were born. I felt it as a coolness in the blood. The sisters were its point, and its blade. Their silent presence sharpened the edge until it parted. Thought from thought with surgical kindness. A man 2 bunks up, began to whisper back to the thing that had offered him a ledger. The sister looked at him and the whisper went out like a wick pinched between wet fingers. He did not try again. Hours, or what translation uses instead of hours, poured over us. Sleep here was not sleep but truce. When the straps were loosened to allow us to stand and flex, we did so in the small universe marked off by our chains. Knees creaked, shoulders rolled. Someone laughed softly at the relief of being vertical, and then clapped a hand over his own mouth as if he had spoken a name that might turn an answer. A servitor came and placed a bowl on my rail. The broth within was clear and almost tasteless, and I realized with dizzy gratitude that it had been warmed. I did not know whether to be grateful to the adept who had ordered it so, or to the impersonal smoothness of the machine that had delivered heat to liquid to mouth to blood. Gratitude, here as anywhere, is a discipline. The bleed returned sharper. This time it came as a pressure behind the teeth, the sense of someone standing very close behind me and leaning just enough to be impolite. It wore my father's breath for a heartbeat, old tobacco, engine grease, and then it wore the minor woman's memory of mountain air, thin and clean, and then it wore nothing at all, which was worse. I fixed my eyes on the bruised light, pooling under the Aquila, and built a wall with small truthful things. The number of bolts in the bunk frame, visible from where I sat, the way the ward ink flaked where oil mist had eaten it, the faint difference in tone between the Geller chord and the drive note. The sisters' proximity made the mortar hold. Something tested the field then. You could tell by the way the hum climbed a fraction and settled with a sound that was not sound, a held breath released. The bunks shivered once like horses feeling a shadow. Chains clicked in a brief, perfect unison, a chime of iron so clean it hurt. The pilgrim pressed his tin charm into his palm, and bent his head, not to pray aloud but to keep his throat safe from the idea of speaking. Across the aisle, a woman began to cry in the way of those who have cried quietly for a long time, and are now too tired to hide it. A warden's gauntlet rested for a breath on the rail beside her bunk, not touching her, only present, as if to say that bodies were here, not only thoughts. The translation phrase lengthened into something like weather. Once distant and ugly, a sound like torn parchment ran along the hull, and the incense burners sang again, discordant and sweet. The Aquila's resin plane reflected a shape that could not be in the room, and therefore was only in my head, and therefore was nowhere, and therefore could do nothing. The logic did its work. I repeated it in my mind, the way a drowning man repeats the shape of shore. When the worst of it came, it did not announce itself as worst. A seam opened in the air over the aisle at knee height, too small to be seen outright, large enough to let through a thing like a moth, if a moth were a thought with teeth. The Geller field seized the seam shut in less than a heartbeat, but not before the thing slid across the skin of the world like a knife across wax. The sister's head turned a degree. The boy gasped once, the gasp of someone emptying out a glass in surprise. On my tongue lay a taste of brine and rot, as if a tide had receded in a room where there had never been seep. The seam was gone. The hum steadied. The moth idea left no shadow, only an instruction: do not be a door. After the hold's quiet changed again. People breathed as if they had been taught how. Small motions returned, a man adjusting the set of his chain with his knee, the miner woman rolling her shoulders against the webbing, and settling like a stone in a stream. The Aquila resumed being a carved emblem, and not a presence. The incense made its slow threads through air that had remembered itself. Time, or the warp's approximation of it, flowed on. When the straps were unbuckled for the sanctioned hour of stand sleep, we stood where we had been placed, and let our knees soften and our spines lengthen by one vertebra. A medicae passed along the aisle with a tray of ampoules, pressing one to each wrist iron so that the metal cooled and tightened, and then warmed again, a reset that blood read as permission to continue. At my turn he paused, lifted my cuff slightly, and frowned in a way that had no malice. Blue band ration increased, he said to the slate, and the slate made its obedient chime. The servitor behind him placed a second bowl on my rail, identical to the first, as if the ship were feeding not generosity but function. I ate without haste, grateful in the exact dimension the food deserved and no more. That too is a discipline. Much later, if later can be trusted, the bell that had marked translation struck a second time, a single clean note that hung in the air until it seemed the hull must wear it forever like scent. The Geller cord eased by a hair. The incense burners began to sway again in air that acknowledged directions. The Vox offered the catechism in reverse, the same words ordered like bolts reclaimed and set back in their original holes. Maintain posture, fix eyes downward, do not answer any voice at all. The sister's presence thinned but did not depart, like a hand withdrawn from a basin leaving a cooler oval behind. The hatch locks cycled, one after another, a ripple of consent through iron. A warden stepped inside, and read a list of names with the neutrality of a rain gauge. Mine was last. The blue band door waited with its small indifferent lumen. The miner woman looked as if she might try to speak, her hands flexed and then stilled. I tightened my grip on small truthful things. Bolt count, flaking warding difference in tone. When the chain at my wrist drew me upright, I stood into it willingly, because the ship is a machine and machines are comfort so long as you do not ask them for mercy. The sister pivoted, the room cooled, and we were led past the Aquila, toward a stair that ran neither up nor down but away. Somewhere ahead, the ship had arranged another chamber like a question.
Chapter 3. Whispers in the Void. The stair that ran away from the world ended in a corridor that had been polished by worry. Boots and bare feet had scuffed a shine into the deck, a low gloss that reflected the lumen as a seam of dull light running down the spine of the hull. Here the ship's voice was closer to the skin, drive pulse, life sustainer drone, the steady canticle of the Geller field like a wire drawn through bone. The sisters did not so much escort us as remove anything that might want to touch us. Their absence preceded us by a pace, leaving the air clean and thin, a winter breathed through iron. We were taken past doors marked with sigils I did not know, and did not want to learn. Behind one, a choir was practicing the Imperialis in silence, the shape of the words moving through throats without sound, a discipline taught in places where sound can be a betrayal. Behind another, liquid chimed against glass at a measured tempo, as if the room had learned to count by listening to itself. A shrine was set in a niche at the corner where the corridor turned, the brass Aquila small, its heads worn smooth by 1,000 glances. A single guttering taper burned there, a needle of light sewing the seam between steel and faith. No one reached for it. We had learned the cost of reaching. The chamber assigned to Blue Band was neither a cell nor a nave. It had the posture of both benches arranged in arcs as if to receive instruction, restraints neatly coiled at each seat to remind the body how to behave. At the center stood a plinth with nothing atop it, yet every eye found it, and then slid away, as if something had sat there once and left a dent in the air. Adepts moved at the perimeter, gray-hooded, hands folded when they were not measuring. A Vox grill in the ceiling exhaled a low thread of ship breath, the syllables of old catechism braided into the ventilation. I tasted oil and incense and the sweet metallic tang of recycled copper. Hunger had become a background music the body had learned to ignore. Thirst, a teacher with We were seated with care that did not feel like gentleness. A circlet was pressed to my temples again, new, lighter, its interior facets cold as if it had been stored in snow. It sang a half note below the field's chord, and where the two tones met my thoughts flattened as parchment under a straight edge. The sister took her station behind us, a stillness that sculpted the room. The warden by the hatch looked not at us, but at the adepts, awaiting the rhythm of their work the way a soldier awaits the measured turns of drill. The first test of that hour had no name I knew. An adept held up a palm-sized slate, on which a ripple of light moved in patterns that disagreed with one another, like two rivers meeting. "Attend," he said, the word almost kind. "Observe without following." I tried to look without going. The ripple offered a path the way a current invites a leaf. The circlet tightened when my attention leaned, eased when I righted myself. Around me, breaths shortened, then lengthened, then settled into the irregular non-cadence the ship preferred. The ripple resolved into something like handwriting, and then into snow, and then into an empty page. The adept lowered the slate. "Again," he said, which is the first word in every liturgy of survival. We did not speak. Speech in that room would have been like striking flint in an oxygen-rich hold. Yet meaning passed, the minor woman's shoulders level as a horizon, the pilgrim's thumb worrying the edge of his token where the strap allowed, a skinny man across the arc, staring not at the plinth, but at the space above it, face set in the rapture of someone listening hard to a silence he has elected to trust. We were not companions. We were weather moving through the same valley, learning the shape of the hills by how the wind curled. The second test asked us to close our eyes. That was all. Close and do not open until told. The circlet cooled. The ship's hum lifted the small hairs at the nape. Behind the lids, the dark was not blank. It had texture, the grain of old wood and the fine grit of ash. A sound like murmuring came and went, a congregation one room over, or water under stone, or the sibilant petition of something not permitted entry. My left hand tried to curl. The strap corrected it without malice. "Attend," the adept said again. Now far, now near, his voice threaded through the field. "Do not follow." I stood in a street I had known as a child, and had not seen in years. I knew it by the way the rain beaded on the broken glow globes, and by the slant of the laundry lines between windows. Except the street was too narrow by a hand's width, and the smell of hot loaves from the vendor's cart was over-sweet, like bread gone wrong. A man passed me, whose face I knew, and could not name. In his shadow, a second set of feet walked, not touching ground. I said the number of bolts in the bench between my fingers. I named the difference in tone between the drive and the field. The street thinned until it was only the width of a thought, and then was gone. "Attend," the adept said. "Breathe." I did both as if they were the same thing. When I opened my eyes at the command, the room had not changed, and had changed utterly. Someone 2 benches over was crying without tears. His face had learned the motion so well it no longer needed water. The pilgrim's tin charm left a smear of red on his palm. The minor woman's jaw worked once, and then stilled as if she had decided to keep a word in her teeth like a nail. The sister's visor held our reflections, and returned them smaller than we were. It is a kind of mercy, to reduce a thing until it can fit safely in a gaze. The bleed found a crack then, not a seam like before, not a door, only a flaw in the varnish of the air. It tasted of penny metal and rain, and the sweetness of a fruit I had never eaten. It wore my mother's hush the way a thief wears a shawl taken from a line, with disrespect, and with the knowledge that possession will be brief. It placed a thought in my mouth like a coin. "You could be more than this," it suggested, without words. "You could be a blade any hand could wield. All you must do is loosen that small thing you keep clenched." I let the coin sit on my tongue and did not swallow, and did not spit. The sister's presence moved closer without moving, and the coin tarnished so quickly, it left only bitterness, and the numbness of old ice. Far off, the bell struck once, the same measured note that had marked our entry. The Geller cord shifted minutely down and then up, the way a ship will slide under a wave, rather than climb it. A servitor rolled a cart into the chamber and set down a rack of ampoules, each stamped with a numeral and a sigil. The adept in gray moved down the line, pressing one to each circlet, expressionless but not unfeeling, his attention a clean instrument. When he reached me, he hesitated a heartbeat, reading whatever the circlet had recorded. "Hold," he said to his slate, and the slate obediently held. He pressed the ampoule home. A coolness ran over my scalp and down behind the eyes, not erasing anything, only drawing a thin veil over the sharper edges. The ship's hum seemed a step farther away. I could breathe around it. We were dismissed in threes, led back into the corridor that smelled of ritual and recycled rain, then down another, which had the confidence of a vein. The sisters bracketed us like parentheses. I realized with a clarity I did not want that I would miss them, if I survived to miss anything. The way their null aura made the world honest for a handful of breaths. A wrong kindness perhaps, but a kindness all the same. The dormitory we returned to had learned us while we were gone. The bunks looked smaller, the Aquila's resin black seemed deeper, the incense chains had gathered a dust of ash that had not been there before. A new body had taken the top pallet where the laughing boy had been, a woman with scarred knuckles, and the watchful stillness of those who have had to raise their voices over machinery to be heard. She looked at the Aquila, then at the straps, then at me. We did not nod. We had learned to save gestures for moments when they were currency rather than waste. Lights dimmed by a fraction. A ration slot sighed. The broth was cooler this time, and my body was grateful without advertisement. I slept with the discipline of a soldier in a trench, surface only, ready to be woken by a change in weather rather than by sound. The dream came almost at once, a long hall of mirrors with the glass turned inward so that they reflected only themselves, a book chained to a plinth under the sea, a door that would not drown. The field's cord ran through the dream like a spine, and kept it on its feet. I woke with the taste of copper and dust in my mouth, and the certainty that a name had been spoken in the night. Not mine, not aloud. A name that was also a direction, a name the warp itself uses to point at a thing it wants. The Aquila looked back with the same indifference it had shown every hour. A sister's shadow crossed the viewport and paused, and in that pause the itch behind my eyes went quiet like snow. Somewhere in the ship, a new muster had begun. The bell did not sound. It did not need to. The hull carried the intention the way bone carries ache before rain. When the hatch opened, the list read was shorter than before. Our row had been clipped. 3 names. The minor woman's. The pilgrim's. Mine. The strap slid from my shoulders the way a hand leaves a shoulder it has steadied for as long as it was able. The chain at my wrist tugged once, not ungently. I rose into it, counted bolts, marked ward ink, found the difference between cord and drive, and followed the absence in front of me toward whatever the ship had decided I should be next.
The corridor led us into a section of the ship that felt more alive than anything we had seen before. Not alive in the way of flesh and pulse, but alive like a machine that had decided to dream. The walls sweated with condensation, rivulets catching the lumen and turning into false veins of light. The air was thicker, warmer, carrying a charge that lifted every hair on the body and made the tongue taste of iron filings. It was the unmistakable sign of proximity to the warp, as if the Imperium itself were leaning against the hull and pressing its cheek to the cold steel. We were unchained from our benches and tethered to one another instead, 6 psykers in a chain, our cuffs joined by lengths of blackened iron, so heavy the links clanged against the floor. A sister walked at our front, a warden at the rear, their presence bookending us like punctuation to a sentence none of us wanted to finish reading. The minor woman was on my left, the pilgrim with his tin charm on my right. I could feel both of them in ways I should not have been able to. Thoughts bleeding like warmth through fabric, the shape of their fears pressing faintly into my own mind. It was not deliberate. The warp made us porous. The chamber they led us into had no icon, no Aquila, no saint, no ward ink, only a bare oval room with walls slick as glass,
The lumen strips set in a circle high above so that the light fell directly down, and left our faces overexposed and our shadows stretching thin and trembling across the floor. The sisters preferred it this way. I realized the absence of symbols, the stripping of everything but us. Here there could be no illusions of protection. Here we were only what we were, raw, dangerous, unfinished. We were made to kneel in a circle, chains stretched taut, so we bowed toward one another. The circlets returned, colder this time, placed with precision by adepts whose gloved hands never hesitated. When mine bit into my temples, the world narrowed. I could hear not only the hum of the Geller field, but the seam where it rubbed against something vast outside, as if the ship were a drum stretched over a bottomless void, and some hand was drumming on it far away. The adepts left without ceremony, the hatch sealed. Only the sister remained, her visor a blank moon above us, her silence denser than gravity. We waited, the ship breathed, and then the whispers began. At first they were indistinguishable from memory. My father's voice reciting an old worker's prayer, the miner woman muttering numbers that sounded like tally marks, the pilgrim's voice caught in a hymn he had not sung in years. But the voices overlapped wrong, the words spilling across each other, not carried by lips or lungs. They grew louder without growing clearer, until every breath I took was filled with phrases that refused to finish. I clenched my fists until the cuffs cut skin, and the blood was a relief, a proof of reality. One of the six began to rock, a boy younger than the rest of us, his eyes darting as if chasing shapes just beyond the lumen's reach. His lips parted, and something else spoke through him. Not words, images, the smell of salt air, the sight of a shore that had never existed, the feel of chains rusted with centuries of water. It flooded all of us at once. I gasped as my throat filled with brine that was not there. The pilgrim fell sideways, choking. The sister took a step, and with her step came stillness. The boy collapsed into silence, sweat running down his temples like rain. The whispers did not stop. They circled the room, trying new voices, new faces, my mother's, my own, the miner woman's, each bent slightly wrong. Open, they urged, though the word came slanted. Door, open, let. The circlet tightened, cutting thought short. I bowed my head, and the floor beneath my knees vibrated with the hum of the ship, as if it were reminding me whose cage this truly was. The pilgrim began to weep without sound, clutching his token until his palm bled. The miner woman closed her eyes and mouthed something I could not hear. The sister remained perfectly still, her silence an answer louder than all the voices in the void. That was when I understood. The whispers were not meant to break the ship, they were meant to break us, and the black ship would let them try, again and again, until it learned which of us bent, and which of us broke.
The bleed did not sharpen so much as gather itself the way a tide does before it turns. The floor's faint vibration braided with the field's cord, until sensation and sound were a single rope running through the bones. Across from me, the boy's jaw worked as if he were chewing gravel. The pilgrim's token clicked faintly against his cuff with each heartbeat. Somewhere above, as unreachable as stars, the ship made a decision. A deeper hum came online, an undertone like a door set into its frame. The sister's visor tipped a degree as if acknowledging an old adversary that had kept its appointment. Impact did not come from outside. It came from within and through. A pressure bulged between us, first as a bruise of air, then as a distortion that made the lumen bands wobble like reflections in disturbed water. Memory fractured, then recomposed in another's arrangement. My father's boot marks on manufactorum dust became the miner woman's footprints in talc white ore. Her prayer beads became the pilgrim's tin charm held in the fist of a child I had never been. Each image snagged and tore as it passed from skull to skull, leaving fibers behind, threads that did not belong to their new fabric, yet insisted on being woven. The boy's head snapped toward me. I saw myself reflected in his eyes, and then not myself at all, but an empty cot in a hab with two bowls set out, one full, one waiting. No, I said without sound, because sound would give the vision a mouth.
The circlet bit cold into my temples, a warning and a mercy. I counted bolts. I named the difference between the field and the drive as if reciting the names of saints. The pressure recoiled and found another purchase, a weak seam where an old grief lived in the pilgrim and had not yet learned to hide under the new disciplines. He sucked in a breath as if to drown. His charm clicked twice and cut his palm open. Blood welled and ran down his wrist iron in two precise paths, finding the same grooves countless others' blood had found. The first scream came from no throat. It came from the room. Air tore like sailcloth in a gale. The lumen flared hard white and then steadied, choosing to forgive rather than to accuse. A seam opened, a proper one this time, clean as a surgeon's cut, and something thin and curious slithered along it, like a question looking for an answer it could devour. The sister moved. She crossed the space between steps, absence preceding her like a cold wind through a fever ward. Her gauntlet rose and did not quite touch the seam. The nothing she carried pressed outward and the cut refused to remain. Edges kissed, sealed, forgot they had ever been parted. The boy gagged on a mouthful of brine that never had water in it, and coughed until the ghost of salt left his lungs. We were not spared a second lesson. The pressure returned not as invasion but as sympathy gone wrong. Our minds, newly porous, tried to comfort one another the way hands in a dark room will reach and meet and clasp. Fingers laced became shackles. I reached for the minor woman's steadiness and brought back her fear of caves that sing, her memory of a cousin swallowed by a shaft that had given all its timbers to the fire of some distant war. She reached perhaps for my small truths and brought back my mother's last winter, the day the heat failed and the water came out of the tap like thin metal. We flinched from the sincerity of each other, and that flinch tore the fabric wider. Compassion, weaponized by the sea. The adepts returned with their silence sharpened into tools. They did not rush. Speed is a kind of panic. One set a tripod in the center and unlatched a cylinder whose surface drank lumen the way deep water eats lamplight. He spoke a word that was less a noun than a boundary. The cylinder vibrated at a frequency that made my molars ache, and the whispers recoiled from it, as if it were a cliff newly inserted into a plain. Another adept pushed a cart bearing a rack of ampoules. The sigils on this set were black instead of red, the glass thicker, as if meant to hold not liquid but instructions. He pressed one to each circlet in turn. When it touched mine, the world narrowed to a corridor with straight walls. The pressure could still shove at me, but it could not find purchase enough to get its shoulders through. If the warp cannot come in, it will try to make you go out. An idea like thirst arrived, simple and absolute open. You are a door shaped like a person. The hinge is your pity. The latch is your memory of mercy. Open and the ache will stop. The sister did not move, and that stillness was the command that saved us. I built my small wall again. Bolt count, oil flaking, cord versus drive. I added the weight of the chain that linked us six, its stubbornness, its refusal to be anything but itself. I added the count of breaths between the cylinder's pulses. I added the taste of broth that had not been cruel. The idea gnawed and found no soft wood. The boy broke anyway, not in any dramatic way. His eyes went wide and then very calm, the relief of a man who has decided to set down a heavy thing, even if it will cost him his back. His circlet chimed once, a delicate sound, and the seam winked open above his crown, like a second mouth waiting to be fed. The sister reached him with that absence that is also grace. Her gloved hand rested on his forehead for the length of a single bell beat. The seam sealed with a little pop, like a jar appeased by pressure. The boy sagged, emptied of willingness if not of blood. The adept behind him tightened the circlet by one tooth and marked a slate with a gesture whose economy suggested grief practiced into efficiency. The pilgrim did not look at the boy. Refusal is sometimes the only kindness we can afford. He fixed his gaze on the cylinder and whispered within his skull, the way he had been taught to whisper prayers in foundries, where sparks make a mockery of unguarded words. The minor woman set her jaw on a phrase I could not hear. and would never ask to. I made an inventory of the room for the 1000th time, and found a new thing to count. The micro-pitting on the floor, where knees had worn the anti-slip into a new pattern, like a map of tides. The pattern calmed me. It suggested that endurance leaves fossils even in iron. Time, translation time, the ship's private calendar, looped and straightened by turns. The cylinder sang, the field held, the adepts watched us without hate, and without hope, because hope is a tool too sharp for this work. The whispers changed tactics and flattered restraint, promising commendations that do not exist, ranks we would never wear, a place at a table we would never see. It tried horror after, a child crying, a lover calling, the exact remembered click of a door latch at the hour a father did not come home. The sisters' aura stared those things down, until they remembered they were only noise painted in familiar colors. They peeled away like dead paint under clean rain. At some unmarked threshold, the pressure thinned. The lumens ceased their high trembling, and fell steadily. The seam lines in the air became only air. The cylinder's vibration eased from a wince to a tolerable thrum. The adepts relatched it, their hands steady, their faces left exactly where discipline puts them, when it has done its day's work. The alternating cold and warmth of the ampoules in our circlets withdrew, leaving a wake of fatigue that felt almost like kindness. The sister did not relax. Statues do not slacken. But her helm dipped once, less a nod than a note entered correctly into a ledger. Test conducted, subject contained, passage maintained. We were unlinked, finger by finger, wrist by wrist. Iron left skin, leaving bracelets of red that would make maps later on if we lived long enough to own maps. The boy was led away between a warden and an adept, walking, not carried. Punishment and mercy look alike from behind. The pilgrim's blood had dried in 2 narrow streams down his cuff. He rubbed them with his thumb until the flakes came off like rust. The minor woman met my eyes for the breadth of a breath, and let go before the moment became a bridge. We had learned our lessons too well to waste them. When the hatch unsealed, the corridor outside smelled like ordinary ship again. Oil, breath, old incense. The absence of salt in the air was a hymn. A bell far in the hull struck once, patient as a clock in a monastery, where hours are both cage and comfort. We rose and followed the punctuation of our escorts back toward the parts of the vessel where symbols returned to the walls, and the Aquila reclaimed its place as the thing every glance must touch before it rests. At the turn a shrine waited, smaller than a hand. Someone had wedged a fragment of copper wire into the ashtray, bent into the shape of a fish. No one acknowledged it. The ship did not either, but the field's cord seemed, for a breath, a fraction warmer, as if the machine had noticed a human gesture and filed it correctly under weightborne. The dormitory doors parted. The bunks received us like old oaths. The incense swung. The resin Aquila drank light. A servitor brought bowls that steamed faintly, and set them into rails that knew our hands by now. I ate. I counted bolts. I listened to the cord and the drive and the lives around me settling back into their harness. The itch behind my eyes returned in a smaller shape, manageable as a splinter. The boy's palate remained empty. The straps lay folded, awaiting the next name. We slept the way soldiers sleep in a lull, one ear open for weather. In the not quite dark, the Aquila seemed farther away, a mercy or fatigue playing good priest. Somewhere in the ship, a list was being revised. Somewhere farther still, a destination burned on a route chart no psyker ever sees. The bell would sound again. The seam would test again. Blue band would be called again, sorted again, shaped again, until the ship decided what portion of us would be fed to judgment, and what small remainder might be taught to live with a leash inside the skull.
Chapter 4. The veil of the sanctioned. They woke us with light, rather than with sound, a clean white, that made the resin Aquila seem to retreat into its own shadow. Names followed. Short list, new cadence, blue band, 3 drawn and 3 left, as if a scale within the ship had found its fulcrum, and was testing weights.
Mine. The minor woman, not the pilgrim. His charm lay cupped in his palm, as if it had slept there, and would go on sleeping. The wardens unlatched the straps, with the care of men who remove fuses. We stood into our harness, and faced the hatch, because there was nowhere else to face. The sisters bracketed us as before, and their absence smoothed the roughness inside the skull to a workable plane. What changed was the destination. We did not descend into the deep where the Geller fields sang loud as surf. We climbed toward a temperate zone in the hull, where the air held the faint sweetness of antiseptics and old parchment. The corridors here were painted a paler gray, and the ward ink had been set with the attention of craftsmen rather than the haste of sailors. The aquilid mounted at intervals were polished and whole. The ship had a face it showed to different classes of necessity, and this was its face for judgment that wanted to be mistaken for mercy. Archways gave way to an antechamber that had once been a chapel and had been revised into a hall of interviews. The stained glass at its far wall, never meant for stars, had been preserved behind a panel of plasteel, the colors reticent and cold. Rows of benches faced a dais where a lectern stood without a book. Behind it, on a raised platform, a simple chair waited as if it had always belonged to the air above the room. Adepts moved in quiet lines along the perimeter, gray hoods lowered, hands occupied with slates and ampoules. The floor bore the scuffed arcs of many feet, wearing pathways into the devotional geometry. Above, the vox did not breathe catechism, but only moved air, as if to remind lungs of their vocation. They placed us on the front bench, like penitent schoolchildren. The circlets did not come. Instead, a collar was buckled at the base of my skull, no heavier than a hand, its interior set with cold facets that rasped against the nerves at the nape. It did not sing, it listened. When the clasp closed, a spreading quiet rolled outward from the vertebrae, like oil poured on a riled sea. The itch behind the eyes dimmed to a patient ember. It felt, for a dangerous heartbeat, like relief. From a side door came a man in robes the color of old vellum, bound at the waist with a cord into which were knotted sigils of office. He wore no helm, no mask, only a face that had practiced stillness long enough to seem like kindness. At his throat glimmered a small Chalcedony seal, stamped with the symbol of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. He mounted the dais without hurry and surveyed us with a gaze that did not search and did not accuse. It weighed. "You have survived translation," he said, voice neither warm nor cold. "An initial evaluation. You will now be measured for service, or for release from burden." Release. The word moved through the benches like the first breeze after weeks of heat. It could mean death as easily as life. The ship used language the way surgeons use knives. The man's eyes touched mine, and passed on without snagging. "I am Magister Halvern," he said. "In my keeping are the weights, the measures and the litanies, by which the Emperor's safety is purchased. If you are found fit for instruction, you will be passed to the Scholastia Psykana for binding, training, and leash. If you are found unfit, your burden will be lifted and placed where it serves mankind." No one spoke, but on the benches a very small muscle under the minor woman's left eye jumped and went still. Rumor moves even in places where voices are forbidden. We had heard, in our low-banded dormitories, and our blue-banded holds, that there are fates within the black ships, more various than sanction and void. There are conduits that lead to labyrinthine wheels of prayer and pain, whose purpose no one aboard is permitted to confirm. There are dark holds where the unsanctioned lie in ranks, and their breath is counted on ledgers, whose sums are carried to Terra. Some say the Golden Throne consumes more than money and faith. Some say it asks for minds. No adept aboard will confirm that story. None will deny it either. Stories like that are designed to be true even when they are not. Magister Halvern raised a hand. Adepts moved as ideas moved toward completion. We were called by bands rather than by names. Green first, the ones who had come back to the dormitory, with eyes that looked at distance as if it were a problem they could learn to solve. Then Amber, who returned the way you return from a dream you are ashamed to have enjoyed. Blue after,
the uncertain measure whose math the ship kept reworking, as if it might yet find an integer where there was only remainder. The miner woman went before me. They seated her in the simple chair on the dais, as if she were guest, not cargo. The collar at her nape lit faintly from within, its facets waking one by one like city lights seen from a shuttle on final approach. Halvern placed a hand upon the lectern, as if he meant to swear by it, and then did not swear. He asked questions that were not questions, the shape of a number she had once used to count ore loads, the smell of a rain she had never felt because her shift was always below, whether the Emperor's name sounded heavier in her left ear, or her right. Her answers were spare and unflinching. When he bid her picture a candle, and then blow it out, the collar at her neck cooled with the change, and an adept made a mark that might have been approval, might have been only record. Then he asked her to imagine a door with her name on it. "Do not open it," he said, and her jaw worked around a word no throat should have to swallow. The collar warmed. The sister by the side arc became, somehow, more present without moving. The room adjusted to her the way a harbor adjusts to a ship of deeper draft. The miner woman's eyes filled, emptied, steadied. "Good," Halvern said, not as praise, not as comfort, only as a datum correctly entered on a line. He raised 2 fingers. The adept to his right struck a chime that did not ring but was heard. The collar dimmed. They unstrapped her, stood her, passed her to a side bench where the green-banded sat at disciplined rest. Her eyes found me for the width of a heartbeat. The nod she gave was not triumph. It was a thing farther from fear. My turn. The chair was wood under the paint, old, repaired where a weight had cracked a leg. I put my hands flat on its arms so I could tell myself later I had kept them from shaking. Halvern considered me the way surveyors consider a line cut through brush, what it intends, what it will cost to keep straight. The collar warmed. "Identify the nearest star," he said, and the field's cord seemed to tilt for the barest fraction, as if to warn that it would not help. I did not reach for knowledge, I reached for honesty, and let ignorance sit where it belonged. "Unknown," I said. He made no mark. "Then the direction of the light that led you here." I did not say down or above, because on a ship down and above are negotiations between mass and intent. "Forward," I said. "To the left and behind." He looked at my shoulder, not my face, and the corner of his mouth tightened as if a ledger somewhere had carried a 1. He asked me to say the Emperor's name within my skull, and then to say it again, as if I were someone else. He asked me to listen for footsteps where there were none, to imagine a flame, and then to identify the fuel, in terms that were not chemical but moral. The collar cooled and heated like a clock counting seconds in molten glass. I answered and did not embroider. When he asked me to greet a voice that wore my mother's hush, I said, "No." When he asked me whose name I would speak first if the warp offered me a bargain, I said no name at all, because names are doors. For the first time something like approval, not human, not warm, but structural, moved through the room like a draft through a church. He changed his angle. "What shape is patience?" he asked, and the question was not metaphysics but function. "A bolt," I said. "Threaded." He nodded once, and the collar cooled as if it had been burning. "What shape is disobedience?" A door stamped into soft wood. The sister's visor bound my reflection into a small disciplined oval of light. "What shape is hope?" he asked. The collar waited. So did he. So did the ship. "A ledger balanced by a hand I will never see," I said finally. And if that was a lie, it was the kind that keeps a man alive without flattering him. Halvern's hand left the lectern and returned, a motion so small it might have been a habit to ease the ache in old fingers. He said nothing for a time that the ship called now, then to the adept, binding potential marginal, discipline above expectation, risk acceptable with leash. He turned his head a degree toward the sister. She did not nod. She did not need to. The collar dimmed. The chair released a small trapped breath. The warden's hand landed on my shoulder like punctuation at the end of a sentence that promised there would be another sentence after it. We did not watch those who did not return from the side door behind the dais. We had learned by now that witnessing has obligations we could not afford, but we heard the chime that marked release from burden,
As surely as we heard the softer chime that marked pass to instruction, the two notes were designed to be cousins on the tongue, so that a man could tell himself he had heard either when he could not bear to know which. They processed us until the lumen's angle changed, and the air took on the tired smell of scrubbers that have worked beyond their duty cycle. Halvern's voice grew more silken with fatigue, which is another word for mercy rationed properly. The benches filled and emptied like lungs. The green-banded side bench thickened. The amber thinned and replenished erratically. The blue stayed thin as a razor's back. The minor woman sat beside me with hands still and breath regular, her eyes not on the door to our right which led to instruction, and not on the door to our left which led to release, but on the old chapel glass where the colors refused, stubbornly, to tell any story at all. At last the chime sounded in the ceiling. That meant shift change, or prayer, or simply that the ship preferred an hour to end, when its ledger said so. Halvern bowed his head, and the adepts closed their slates, with a cadence that held no rhythm. We were uncollared, and rechained, but gently, as if we were now tools placed back into a drawer rather than hazards returned to containment. On the way out, we passed a narrow alcove where a servitor cleaned the floor with a brush fine as eyelashes, scrubbing at a patch that was not stained and would never be. For a blink, in a reflection caught in the servitor's polished jaw, I thought I saw rows upon rows of pallets in a hold too vast to live inside any hull, and shadows on those pallets breathing in time with the field. The thought slid away before it could become disobedience. In the corridor, the pilgrim waited with others, hands folded, token in palm. His eyes searched mine, not for result but for residue. I gave him what I could, a small nod that admitted a future however leashed. He exhaled, a prayer that did not risk the emperor's name, and turned his face toward the antechamber as if to volunteer his own weighing. The sister's shadow crossed his feet like a benediction written by a steady hand. They brought us not to the dormitory, but to a new compartment that smelled faintly of paper and blood. The bunks here were single, the straps broad and unfrayed, the lumen gentle as an apology no one would ever speak. A brass aquila hung above the door, and had been polished until, for the span of a blink, you could mistake it for light. On each bunk lay a strip of cloth stamped with a numeral and a sigil, our leash's first gentle tug. The minor woman touched the edge of hers with a finger that had learned, at last, to be still in the presence of choices that are only shapes painted on walls. The bell in the hull marked an hour we would learn to call instruction. The field's chord shifted by a hair toward a brighter note, as if somewhere aft a hand had turned a wheel with reverent care. The ship held us as a teacher holds a class that has not yet decided whether what it is about to learn will save it or finish the work the sea began. I lay back on the bunk, and felt the new straps settle like law. The itch behind my eyes did not vanish, it learned to wait.
The new compartment was not meant to feel like punishment, and that difference unsettled me more than chains. The bunks were evenly spaced, their straps broad and new, free of the grease stains and frayed edges that spoke of desperate hands. The lumen here was softer, a pale gold that gave the metal a warmth it had no right to possess. Each bed bore a folded strip of cloth, stamped with a numeral and a sigil, precise as signatures on a contract. Ours now. Not names, not faces, numbers tied to leashes we could not yet see, but already felt coiling close. The minor woman lay back with her hands open on her chest, eyes closed, but not in rest. She looked as though she were memorizing the shape of the straps, committing them to memory the way a worker counts bolts on a shaft, before trusting the climb. I lowered myself onto my bunk, and the fabric creaked like something welcoming me home. That sound was almost worse than silence. It suggested permanence. The pilgrim joined us later, led in by wardens who released him with the ceremony of placing an offering on an altar. His charm was still in his palm, the smear of dried blood etched into his skin, like a rune no one had taught him to write. He saw us, measured the room, and sat without a word. For the first time since embarkation, his shoulders eased, as though judgment, sanction or release, was easier to bear than waiting. The bell rang within the hull, deeper than before,
a tone meant not for passengers, but for the ship itself. It vibrated through the bunks and the straps and our bones, and when it faded the vox breathed a new instruction. Instruction begins. The adepts filed in, gray hoods lowered, slates carried like relics. They moved with the assurance of men who had watched this same ritual repeat for decades, their motions precise and unremarkable, designed to erase personality rather than display it. They gave us no weapons, no books, no chants. They gave us exercises that existed only inside the skull. Picture a circle, one said, and now picture it burning. The collars at our necks pulsed with heat, measuring our obedience, our stability, our danger. Now close the circle with water. Hold both at once. The minor woman's jaw tightened, and sweat gathered at her temples. The pilgrim's lips moved in prayer, though no sound came. My own mind buckled against the contradiction, and for a moment the circle collapsed into something jagged. The collar shocked me with a cold flash that drove the error out and left me raw but upright. We were pushed again and again, tested on edges the adepts already knew would cut. Hear a voice, now strip it of meaning, now replace it with silence. See a flame, now feed it with grief, then with loyalty, then with nothing at all. Recall your name, now imagine it struck from every record, forgotten by every living mouth. How do you answer when called? Each time the collars tightened, corrected, soothed. They were not tools of pain so much as instruments of tuning, reshaping us like strings pulled to a note. At intervals, the sisters walked the aisles. They never touched us, never spoke, but their silence was the leash that held the room together. Each pass scrubbed the whispers from our thoughts, made our private bleed recede into the corners of the mind, like rats under torchlight. Without them, the exercises would have broken us in hours. With them, the hours stretched into something worse, endurance. By the time the lumen dimmed again, we were hollowed but standing. The adepts marked their slates, unmoved, and left as quietly as they had entered. The straps buckled us into bunks without resistance, and I felt the collar still humming faintly at the base of my skull, as if the lesson continued even in sleep. When my eyes closed, I dreamed not of my own streets or my mother's voice. I dreamed of the circle, burning and drowning at once, endless, unbreakable, and when I woke, I could still hold it.
The days that followed ceased to be countable by any measure I trusted. The bell in the hull divided time into obedient segments, but the lessons bled through the seams as if instruction were a liquid, and our collars were only dam walls with hairline cracks. We learned to let thoughts pass unclaimed, to cradle an image without feeding it, to let a voice arrive and depart without building it a chair. The sisters paced like moons on a tight orbit, and their gravity kept our tides from tearing the room apart. The deeper trials began without announcement. An adept brought a casket no bigger than a child's skull, and set it upon a wheeled stand at the center of the compartment. Its surface bore hexagrammic script so dense the eye could not find a place to rest. When he opened the lid, nothing inside reflected light, and yet each of us felt something lean toward our faces, as if to smell whether we were worth the trouble of devouring. "Attend," he said softly, like a father warning a child not to kick a sleeping dog. "Do not follow." The air cooled, the collars warmed. The thing in the casket, we never heard a name, only a title spoken once by Halvern days later. Reliquary, exhaled the faintest pressure, and with it came the ache of old arguments, and the sweetness of reconciliations that had never happened. The minor woman swallowed, eyes fixed on the rivet just above her bunk edge. The pilgrim closed his hand on his charm until his knuckles went bloodless. The presence in the casket changed tactics, offering relief instead of ache, the memory of a door already locked from the outside. I built my small wall bolt count, the scorched patch under the third lumen, where an earlier lesson had gone wrong, the way the field's chord rose half a tone when the sisters entered and fell when they left, like a choir learning breath. My collar cooled by a finger's width, the reliquary shut. We breathed together, an accidental choir, unpracticed, in tune by fear. After that, instruction wore a sharper face.
The adepts fitted us with psi hoods that hung from the ceiling like harnesses in a manufactorum, each cable armored, each node warded with stamped seals. The hood lowered until its rim kissed the skin above my brow and the base of my skull, making a ring of cold so clean it bordered on kindness. "Signal discipline," Halvern said from the doorway, voice level, ledger in hand. "Project nothing, admit nothing, receive and sort." A thread of sensation pricked the air, not pain but a direction. It brushed my face, my thoughts, the memory of a street I no longer trusted, and withdrew. It came again from another angle, disguised as my own breath. The urge to push back was strong, elemental as the reflex to brace when a blow is coming. The collar pulsed a quiet warning. I let the urge pass like weather. The thread slid off and lost interest. Halvern made a mark whose neatness said he was writing on a table that never wobbled. Rumor found us even here, parceled in glances and in words too small for the sisters to waste their silence on. Blue Band, who passed to green sometimes, went to a place we never saw, a chapel below decks with walls of old brick sealed behind steel, where those marked for greater service were prepared for a rite no one aboard could legally name. Some returned with eyes that watered in every light, and yet did not blink, speaking more gently than before, as if their voices had been filed. Others did not return at all. The words that carried the rumor wore humility like armor. Soul binding is a litany, not a fact, a vow on terra, not in any ship, a metropolitical rite performed by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, under watch long beyond our measures. And yet the scent of ash on those who came back, and the way they navigated rooms by listening rather than by sight, laid a second ledger over the first. Stories like that survive because they refuse to choose between true and necessary. We were not yet of the Scholastia Psykana. We were drafts, margins, sums to be checked. But the shape of leash became clearer. When we failed, the collars corrected. When we succeeded, the collars did nothing at all, which is a praise more honest than any chime. The sisters were the negative space that made the lesson legible. Their silence taught us the grammar of not opening. Their proximity was a blessing with a blade hidden in its spine. I began to crave them as a drowning man craves the feel of river stones underfoot, hard, unyielding proof of ground. One evening, if evening can be said to exist on a clock that belongs to engines, Magister Halvern stood at the foot of our aisle and regarded us with an expression that almost admitted fatigue. "Those who measure accept a burden," he said. "It accrues on the soul more reliably than on a slate. If you pass to instruction, you will carry a leash, and in time perhaps be honored to serve as Astropath transcendent, soul-bound and sanctified. If you do not pass, your weight will still be borne. The Emperor wastes nothing that can be turned to the safety of mankind. No boast, no threat." A description of plumbing. After he left, the pilgrim spoke for the first time in days in a voice smooth from being used carefully. "If there is a door," he said, not looking at me, not looking at the minor woman, "and a hand beyond it, and that hand asks for my name to balance a ledger I cannot read, do I offer the name?" The minor woman let the question sit until it cooled, and would not burn any tongue that touched it. "Not if it calls the name first," she said. He nodded, not content, not resigned, simply informed. We lost 2 from our row the next cycle. One went green and then vanished into the brick-walled chapel the rumor had furnished for us. The other sat in Halvern's chair beneath a collar that did not pulse at all while the magister read from a litany we had never heard. The chime that followed was the softer cousin. A servitor cleaned the floor with a brush fine as eyelashes and then kept cleaning. The stain was not in the metal. By increments, the leash tightened where it needed to and loosened where it could. I could hold 2 images without letting either drink the other. I could hear a voice and deny it even the charity of attention. When the reliquary's breath combed our thoughts for splinters, I let it pass as a comb passes through shaved hair. The minor woman learned to keep a count in her jaw, tiny motions only she could feel, marking patience without cadence. The pilgrim taught himself to open his hand and let the charm rest there without gripping until his palm bled. It is a discipline to stop hurting yourself. When sleep came,
it brought a different dream. Not the circle, not the drowned book. A great wheel, slow and patient, turning under a mountain of gold and cables and prayer. A wheel whose spokes were prayers written in human breath. I could not see its hub. I could not see its axle. I could only feel the gravity of its work, and the way it kept a light burning in a sky I would never own. I woke with the taste of ash and copper, and a small treacherous gratitude I did not confess even to myself. On a cycle without a bell to name it, Halvern read a shorter list than usual, and my numeral was there, and the minor woman's, and the pilgrims. The collars cooled as if in respect. The straps folded themselves away with the help of servitor hands. The sisters' absence grew stronger, a winter sharpening. Instruction continues in the annex, Halvern said, ledger closed in his palm, and the word annex felt like a threshold even before I saw the door. We rose as men rise from benches in a court that has learned their names and decided to keep them a while. The corridor smelled of parchment and oil, and somewhere beyond, quiet machines prayed on our behalf with voices only the field could hear.
Chapter 5. Beyond the Golden Throne's Light. The annex lay behind a door that pretended to be ordinary, paint the color of warm bone, a latch that neither stuck nor squealed, hinges that had learned the kindness of silence. But the air beyond it had the stillness of a shrine emptied of everything but purpose. The corridor narrowed, and then widened, as if taking breath, the lumen lowering their gaze until the metal shone like pages thumbed by careful hands. We were fewer now, myself, the minor woman, the pilgrim, 3 numerals that the ship had not yet spent. The sisters escorted us with the gravity of processional candles, their absence picking threads of stray thought from the air and burning them away without smoke. Somewhere aft the field's cord softened by a fraction, not weaker, only more intent, like a bowed head. Magister Halvern waited in a room with no aquila on its wall. The omission read louder than any icon. A table separated us from him, plain plasteel with the dull shine of much cleaning, the edges rounded not by charity, but by regulation. On the table lay 3 collars of a different make, finer facets, narrower clasp, a faint inner sheen as if the metal remembered light. Instruction has carried you as far as this hull permits, he said, not seated, ledger under his palm. Beyond this point your burdens and your uses leave the ship and enter the Imperium proper. It is not for this vessel to pretend it can speak in Terra's voice. He glanced once at the sisters and back to us. But it can speak in its own. He did not embellish. Some of you will travel on in chains of a different kind to the Scholastia Psykana. Leash will grow teeth and purpose. If you are bound and you survive, you will carry words across distances that cannot be measured by rulers, only by prayer. You will hold doors shut that others will spend their lives trying to open. Your names will pass from you, and another name will be given that fits like a brand and eventually like skin. He touched one collar with a fingertip as if testing its temperature. Some of you will be released from instruction to serve a greater engine that does not sit in any ship. You have heard rumors. You may keep them. Rumor is the shape truth takes when it must walk among the living. I will not correct your shapes. I will only say the Imperium wastes nothing. It was the closest thing to a liturgy we had ever heard him speak. The collars on the table listened with us, their facets dull and patient. Ask nothing of me about the throne, he said then, the word quiet and exact, like a bead placed last on a string. If it is your fate to understand more than rumor, understanding will be given, and you will not be able to return it. The pilgrim's fingers tightened, then eased, around his charm. The minor woman breathed through her nose, a measured count, hidden in the muscle at her jaw. I felt the itch behind my eyes evaluate the room and find no purchase. Halvern raised his hand. The sisters stepped back half a pace, a change that rearranged the room's gravity. There is one more passage you must make, he said, not translation, not trial. A weighing, not of power, we have weighed that, not of obedience. Instruction has made its entries, a weighing of willingness. He did not look at us when he said it.
He looked at the collars. What you think you will accept when you are hungry and bound is not the same as what you will accept when you are fed and asked. We were seated, no straps, no shackles. The temptation to read mercy in the omission was a small bright lie. I set it aside where I could see it, as one sets aside a tool one does not dare use. An adept cleaned the back of my neck with a pad that smelled of alcohol and winter. The new collar settled into place with the weight of a hand that could become a fist. It hummed, not the interrogation bite of earlier devices, but a tone so close to the field's chord that for a moment I thought the ship had reached up through metal to touch my spine. A second adept placed his palm flat on the table, fingers spread, and spoke a line of High Gothic, whose meaning the body recognized, and the mind did not. Permission and boundary braided together until they were one thing. We did not close our eyes. The weighing did not require dark. It required seeing ourselves, the ship, the sisters, the nothing on the wall where an Aquila might have been if this had been about comfort. Halvern's voice lowered until it was almost the same volume as breath. You will be offered a bargain you cannot spend. Refuse it as if you were thirsty, and the cup were salt. You will be asked to answer to a name that tastes like yours and is not. Decline it as if it were a door pressed into soft wood. You will be shown an image of the emperor crafted to your size. His mouth moved as if the word cost something even in a room like this. Look at the light, and remember that seeing is not the same as serving. The room did not change. The air did. Something leaned in from the long corridors of the world, not a seam, not a door. Only the sense that the distance between iron and thought had thinned to the width of a sheet of paper. The collar warmed, the sister's absence cooled. The field's cord threaded us to the hull, and the hull to the belly of the ship, and the ship to the fleet, and the fleet, if faith could be a series of rivets to Terra. The bargain came with no words because words can be stored and measured and returned. It came like warmth offered to cold hands, the shape of relief. The suggestion that obedience could be replaced with consent, and consent with exultation. A leash you would beg to wear. I did not answer with cleverness. Cleverness is a glass tool. It breaks and leaves you bleeding. I answered with the small ledger I had been keeping since embarkation. Bolt counts and oil flakes, the notch in a warden's stave, the way the miner woman breathes at the 7th count, and then starts again. The pilgrim's charm leaving a rust-colored crescent in his palm that will not wash away easily. I answered with the ship's patience, which had taught me that mercy is not a mood but a mechanism, and we were safe here only because mechanisms do not lie. I answered with a wordless refusal, hard as the rim of my own skull. The collar cooled. The warmth receded like a tide that has taken you to the neck and decides you are not worth drowning today. Halvern did not nod, because nodding would have made it personal. He looked at the ledger under his hand and made a mark so small it might have been dust settling. The miner woman's eyes were wet and steady, the way a mine wall will shine in lamplight just before it decides to hold. The pilgrim's lips moved, shaping a prayer he had been taught to say only inside his bones. The sisters had not moved at all. We were uncollared. It took half a breath for the skin at the nape to stop remembering the ring. The adepts packed the devices away as if returning relics to their drawer. Halvern spoke the ship's last truth to us. I cannot tell you what door you will pass next, he said. I can only tell you that every door opens toward service, and service is not a word the Imperium uses lightly. If Terra claims you for binding, you will learn a light that burns and does not comfort. If Terra claims you for the throne, he let the word hang again like a bell on a still day. Your breath will feed a fire you will never see. If neither claims you, there are regiments that march until they are names carved on stones no one visits. The Emperor wastes nothing, he gestured, and the sisters stepped forward like night closing politely over a lamp. The corridor beyond the annex had become a crossroads without changing shape. 2 doors waited, one marked with a sigil I had come to associate with instruction, the other with nothing at all. Blankness, I had learned aboard this ship, is a kind of icon. The miner woman looked at me then, really looked,
as if to inventory the shape of the person who had shared her weather. "If we are parted," she said, the words measured so they would not disturb the field. "Remember your small truths. They stack." The pilgrim turned the tin charm over in his palm and finally slid it into the strap at his wrist, as if at last trusting his hand to hold without hurting. "If you must speak my name," he said, barely sound at all, "do not speak it where anything can answer." The sisters indicated our paths with the slightest tilt of their helms. The ship waited, patient as the sea, somewhere far ahead, days or months or a lifetime. The light on Terra burned in a sky we would never touch, held up by wheels and throats and prayers, by names given and names emptied, by leashes that had learned to pretend they were crowns. Somewhere far below, deeper than any hold, a counting was being kept that would not balance until long after our bones were catalogued. The bell in the hull did not ring. It did not need to. We stepped because forward was the only direction left, and because in the end, willingness is only the body moving in the shape the soul has chosen.
The annex doors did not close behind us. They lingered ajar, as though the ship wanted to remind us that whatever came next was not final, only another turn in a corridor without end. The air in this new place was neither the cold sterility of dormitories, nor the fevered press of trial chambers. It was neutral, balanced, like a waiting room in which even the walls had learned patience. Our collars had been removed, but the skin at the nape still hummed with the ghost of their weight. I could feel where the facets had pressed, like phantom teeth, as if my body had already begun to shape itself around obedience. The pilgrim rubbed the shallow wound his charm had carved into his palm until the skin whitened again, as though he were reminding himself that pain could still belong to him and not to the ship. The miner woman flexed her shoulders once, testing freedom the way a miner tests air in a shaft. Neither spoke. We had grown past words where silence carried more weight. Wardens guided us to a dais raised no higher than a man's knee, but its symbolism pressed like stone. Upon it stood a simple lectern, and behind it a figure not robed like Halvern, but armored in dark plates etched with fine scripture. The man's helm was removed, showing a face lined by years of service but unbent by doubt. His eyes did not carry judgment, they carried scale. He spoke as one reciting an oath he had long since become. "You are the remainder," he said. "Sanction has paired you to what can be carried forward. The Imperium takes what it must, and spends what it cannot keep. You may believe you have survived. In truth, you have only been remeasured." His words fell like rivets hammered into steel, each separate, each permanent. "From here, paths divide. Some of you will be led to the Scholastia Psykana. You will be taught leash and litany until your own names dissolve. You will serve as Astropaths, sanctioned and soul-bound. Your eyes burned blind, but your voices carried further than suns. Others will not go to classrooms or leashes. Others will go where no Aquila hangs. Others will feed what must be fed." He did not say the throne. He did not have to. The chamber seemed to darken in its own memory of the word. The miner woman shifted her jaw in that careful rhythm that had carried her through trials. The pilgrim bowed his head, his charm pressing now against the rail of the bench so it would leave its mark there too, as if stone and metal should share the scar. I sat still, but my thoughts worked like teeth grinding on grit. We were hearing what every psyker fears most, that our lives had become currency, and that even our deaths would not be ours to choose. The officer raised a hand. Adepts emerged from side doors carrying long strips of parchment. They unrolled them across the floor like banners, covered in names written, struck, and written again. Ink over ink, scar over scar. A ledger made visible. One adept placed the parchment at my feet. My eyes found a line struck through twice, a line written again beneath in fresh black. It was not my name. Names had been lost long ago. It was my number, a mark of survival, or of postponement. I could not tell which. The officer's voice lowered. "This ship does not choose. Terra will choose. The throne will choose. The Imperium wastes nothing, and you what you are, cannot be wasted. When you leave this hull, You will no longer be you. You will be leash, or you will be fuel, and the stars will burn because you either speak or are consumed. He stepped back. The sisters advanced, their silence making the parchment tremble faintly, as though paper too could fear. They gestured toward 2 doors. One bore the sigil of the Scholastia, sharp and stern. The other bore nothing at all. Blankness again, the icon of what must not be named. The pilgrim rose first, his charm left behind on the bench, a blood-rusted crescent pressed into the wood as his only legacy. The miner woman followed, her stride as steady as stone laid under mountain weight. I did not move until I realized stillness. Here was a kind of refusal, and refusal was only another form of consent. I stood. The ship breathed. The field hummed. The throne waited far beyond. In light no one can look at and live. We walked toward the doors, and the chamber swallowed us as neatly as ink takes paper.
The doors did not open at the same speed. The Scholastia sigil parted with bureaucratic certainty, a measured slide that suggested papers stamped and filed. The blank door considered us first, the way deep water considers weight, then yielded without noise at all, as if it had always been ajar and we were only noticing. The sisters divided, one to each threshold, silence braided with duty. The pilgrim hesitated, not at the doors, but at the memory of benches and collars, and the hum that had taught us to live inside our skulls without leaving the windows open. His hand rose to where the charm would have been, and found air. He turned to the sigil, because a name, any name, is kinder than none. The miner woman looked at me once, a glance like a chalk mark on stone, then faced the blankness. I understood without words that she would rather be unmarked than mislabeled. I did not know which choice was braver, or crueler. We stepped, each into our own weather. The Scholastia corridor smelled of ink, leather, hot metal, the fragrances of institutions that believe in their own permanence. The blank corridor smelled of nothing so much as clean cold, as if it had been scoured by a wind that doesn't exist. I felt both at once, a trick of ship geometry, or of conscience. The field's cord kept its even line, refusing to tell us which world it preferred. Scholastia path widened to admit apparatus, psi hoods polished to an ecclesiarchal gleam, lecterns with clamps meant for books no one living had permission to read, rails for servitors that moved with a care learned from long practice. The pilgrim's shoulders squared as if relieved to see objects arranged in a grammar that could be learned. A sister's absence trimmed the air to fit the lesson. An adept approached him with a cloth strip stamped in fresh ink, new leash, new ledger, and the pilgrim bowed his head into obedience that looked from a distance like peace. A faint smell of myrrh and hot copper, ritual and medicine, threaded the air. He did not look back. The blank path narrowed and dropped, not downwards exactly, but into a pressure where ears wanted to pop and would not. The lumen dimmed by degrees until light came not from strips or sconces, but from the metal itself, a soft exhalation of pallor that did not cast shadows. The miner woman kept the slow count in her jaw. I matched it, not to share breath, bridges are dangerous, but to mirror a rhythm that had held fast when translation tried to break bone from will. The corridor ended in a room without features, no aquila, no shrine, no plinth, only floor, ceiling, walls, all the same patient material that had learned to behave as if stone could be merciful. A single chair waited, ordinary as a kitchen thing, placed in the exact center. The sister with us did not step inside. She stopped in the doorway and became an outline cut from the world. Rumor says such rooms exist on every black ship, cold chapels with liturgies pared to the nerve. Rumor says what happens there is a vow so absolute that language has no teeth for it. Rumor says the vow is not heard by any human ear. Rumor says the vow answers a question that is not asked aloud. Rumor says rumor is a coward's comfort. I stood at the threshold, a witness allowed only to the shape of silence. The miner woman went to the chair because forward was the only direction left. She did not kneel. She sat, hands on thighs, jaw still. The room did not brighten. It simply learned her outline and set it among its other remembered shapes. No sound came, no light changed. The field's cord did not lean in sympathy. And yet something was weighed. I knew it as surely as one knows when the weather has turned. The skin at the back of the neck prickled and then smoothed. The minor woman exhaled once through her nose. The sister's absence thickened and then eased, like a door pushed shut carefully against wind. The blankness accepted a secret and closed its hand around it. When the minor woman rose, her eyes were unchanged. Only her gait had altered, the tiniest fraction, a new economy in the angle of the step, as if she had put down a load no one else could see and taken up another that would never be set down again. She did not look at me or at the sister. She turned toward a second door I had not seen, identical to the first and darker only because it had been closed longer. It opened without sound. She did not look back. What becomes of those who step through blankness? I can tell only what the ship allowed me to think without correction. There are engines in the Imperium that do not turn pistons or bleed heat through radiators. They turn prayers into geometry. They bleed faith into light you cannot look at and live. They ask for names and return numbers. They ask for numbers and return warmth in winter to a million worlds worth of cold rooms. Perhaps the minor woman went to such an engine. Perhaps she became a cog so perfect it left no mark when it turned. Perhaps her breath will be counted on a slate under a mountain the size of a city where a man sits on a chair that eats time. Or perhaps she boarded another ship that bears no sigil and hunts nothing but silence, and her work will be done forever at the edges of seas no star maps admit. A story built of perhaps is not a lie. It is a mercy we give ourselves when doors do not open both ways. I was led along the seam between paths, a corridor that listened rather than spoke. An adept walked ahead with a slate, writing without looking down. The sister behind me kept the air honest. When we reached a junction where the hull grew warmer, and the scent of paper thinned into the sharper ghost of ozone, I understood that my remainder would be spent, if Terra allowed it, in rooms with lecterns and hoods and leashes that taught the head to bow correctly, so the thought does not spill. A training hall waited, benches, collars, a window that was not a window but a screen showing a star chart that rearranged itself as if the galaxy were breathing. I thought of the pilgrim and his charm left on a bench to rust itself into a mark, and was ashamed at how much comfort that relic of pain gave me. Before the sisters turned me over to instruction, Magister Halvern met us once more, ledger under arm, fatigue like a watermark his discipline could not erase. He considered me the way a craftsman considers a tool that can do a job if handled properly, and will maim if not. You will be taught to carry, he said. What you carry will be more than words. Do not mistake distance for safety. Do not mistake light for mercy. Remember your small truths, they stack. The last sentence did not belong to any liturgy I had heard aboard this ship. It belonged to a man who had watched ledgers balance with blood on the pen. He did not dismiss me with a blessing. He did not own the right. He gestured, and the door to instruction accepted my outline. As I stepped through, the hull sounded a single patient bell stroke, the same note that had marked our first translation, the same that had smoothed seams and closed cuts and kept a world's worth of breaths from going wild. It vibrated up my spine and into the ghost teeth the collars had left. For a heartbeat, I tasted broth warmed by a servitor's anonymous courtesy, tin and salt and the discipline of gratitude. For a heartbeat I smelled the minor woman's talc-white ore on her hands and the pilgrim's little crescent of rust. For a heartbeat I felt the ship's austere pride, as if this work, parsing, sifting, spending, were not cruelty but craft. Behind me, the blank door closed as politely as a librarian replacing a book. Before me, the lecterns and hoods made their daily vows to iron. Above and far beyond, in a sky I would never own, a light burned because a wheel I would never see kept turning. I took my seat where I was told and set my palms flat, the way I had learned on the first day to keep from being a door. The ache behind my eyes settled into its harness. The field's cord held, a voice not the warp, not my mother, not any saint, said within the skull in a tone that might have been my own. Attend. Do not follow, carry.